We are still but a few weeks away until spring ball is here for Michigan football, but we are looking at position group by position group, and one of the position groups I'm looking at, if you look at it as a whole, it's got a lot of depth in one place, and in another, it's a little bit more confusing. Let's talk about the defensive backs on this episode of Locked On Wolverines.
You are Locked On Wolverines, your daily podcast on the Michigan Wolverines, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Tuesday. We are back and doing it. Locked On Wolverines podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. I'm your man on the ground, Isaiah Hill, publisher of Wolverines Wire through USA Today Sports Media Group. Trying to stay away from the microphone. Got a little bit of a different setup here. Just FYI, at the top of the show here, there will be no preview as promised for Faith Over Culture podcast because, again, we were postponed by a couple weeks. So look for that more so at the beginning of March with Pastor Robbie Emery. But that's why we're not doing the night episode. We're doing the day episode. Here's where we're at. So let's talk about the defensive backs. That's the safeties and the corners. I could probably do one show on each, but we're going to do it on both. And it's funny because, I've got safety near the top of my list as far as position groups that I think is among the best, if not the best position group on the team. Obviously quarterbacks up there. We did our rankings, right? Defensive line and the safety were the two tops, and then quarterback. And then, I mean, it's such a loaded position group, but then cornerback itself is a little bit more of a question mark. There's really kind of no telling exactly what that's going to be. They did get one safety via the transfer portal, and then they went and tried to get a corner and got one, but doesn't necessarily seem like it's someone that's necessarily going to be a big player per se based off of past experience. So let's go through some of the names here. Actually, they got technically, I guess, two, depending on how you look at Tavis Metcalf, rather. I don't know where Wilson came in. Looking at, I don't even know what I'm looking at. Let's start with the players that I think are essentially going to play starters minutes. Let's start at safety. It's just so deep, right? Because you've got Rod Moore returning, 5th year, expected to be one of the best safeties in college football, was expected to be that going into last year, gets injured in spring ball, quintessential leader, team captain, certainly can be a guy that makes everyone around him better. He's had that impact. You saw that kind of without him, with Makari Page having to kind of figure some things out throughout the course of the year. And then you got a couple of young guys who have come in and played really, really well in Brandyn Hillman and Mason Curtis. Both of them really shined last year, late, especially in the year. Mason Curtis came on super late. Brandyn Hillman showed you some things early and then really played very well in the ReliaQuest Bowl. But when you look at the cornerback position, do you keep Zeke Berry at boundary? At this point, I would say yes, he played very good playing boundary corner, even though he was brought in as a safety and started the year as nickel. And then Jyaire Hill. What to do with Jyaire Hill? Had some growing pains last year, had games like the USC game where he was just completely locked down against a really talented receiving core with a really good quarterback. And then had some other games where you were like, he's a complete liability. Like two games later, he completely locked down against Minnesota. And then 2 games later, he's at Washington looking like he's completely lost, right? So it's kind of hard to make what he's going to be. And then he didn't play that much kind of down the stretch, right? Amir Hall and Zeke Berry were the two as Makari Page moved into that nickel position. And that really kind of worked out well for Michigan. But it's like, okay, does Jyaire bounce back? That's kind of the big question. Can he be that guy that can bounce back and be that big player that we think he was? But Michigan was trying to get a Takario Davis and a Manuel Carnley, Tony Grimes. You can just go down a list of transfers that they were really trying to get, and they didn't end up getting any of them. So that kind of tells you that they don't necessarily feel super great about the position group. And it's a little bit confusing as far as that's concerned. Moving back to safety, there's a couple other players that you feel like can be really high impact players and be in that rotation, right? Michigan likes to have a lot of safeties come in under the Wink Martindale system. You know, you would see obviously not just the 2 safeties, but the nickel. And I'm really not sure who's going to play nickel at this stage. But I mean, it could be I mean, I have no idea, to be honest. There's no one that I can really point to and say they are the obvious nickel. But they've got two other guys that I think could absolutely be players. And that's TJ Metcalf, who comes aboard after a standout season at Arkansas, really a breakout year. But the question is, you saw that Wesley Walker was able to do that at Tennessee, and he only kind of came on strong, again, super late, looked like a liability quite often after being a starter at Tennessee, and kind of figured things out late. So will that transition work out for TJ Metcalf, right? Going to a completely different system, and will he be able to step up? And then Jaden Mangum, who I had penciled in as a starter going into the year last year, ends up not playing at all, being in street clothes for most of the year, graduates from MSU. I'm not really sure what happened there. No one's really gotten clarity. They just said off-field stuff. But then you see he graduates in the winter from MSU with a Michigan block M on his green cap, right? So not really sure exactly what happened there, per se, right? Like, it's very unclear. But he's a guy that was a starter for multiple years at MSU. Coming into year 4, can he be a factor? What did he learn from his year off? Is he really clamoring to get on the field? Is he ready for the competition that he is about to face? That's kind of the question there. So there's a lot of unanswered questions across the board, safety and defensive back, but at least I can look at 3 safeties and say, yes, those are the guys that are 100% going to play, barring any injuries or anything like that. Corner, definitely Zeke Berry, probably Jyaire Hill, but who are the guys who are behind them? The ones that we just mentioned. Let's get into the roster a little bit deeper, talk about every player that we can here, and try to figure out where things go. We will do that here in just a moment. But before we do, this is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Now Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation, an expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress. And you get the most money back, guaranteed, and while you go about your day. So no stressing, no worrying, no waiting. This is now Taxes, Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantee. But yeah, sitting here, if you're watching on video, dressed like a villain, all black, everything. It's funny, when I was in high school, I wore all black like every single day because I was like a metal guy, right? And now it's like pretty rare that I wear all black, but that's where we're at today. Anyway, there's a lot of players that we didn't get to. Really, at the safety position, there's only 4/5, and we still got 6 corners to go through. The big question for me is Jaden McBurrows. Is he back? Number one, is he healthy? Because that could be your nickel, right? Like, he played great as nickel when Mikey Sanders still moved out to corner against Maryland in 2023. I thought Jaden McBurrows looked really good. Like, when he's been out there, he has looked good. The problem is the dude cannot stay healthy to save his life, it seems. He just cannot seem to stay on the field, whether it's some kind of actual injury or maybe it's a rival taking a helmet to his head. Actually, that was more Jamon Green, but nonetheless, same kind of concept, principle, so on and so forth. Can Jaden McBurrows get back into the game? Is he back? Right? There's been no indication whether or not he is actually going to be around the program or not. Right? Like, I say that, like, you take it as like he probably is because there's been nothing. But at the same time, like, guys can just kind of fall off. That happens every time that we see a roster released, right? We go through and see who's on it and who's not on it. We compare it to the last year and all of that. And we have no idea when it comes to Jaden McBurrows what his plans are, if he's medically okay, if he's ready to go, what's the deal there. But he would be my choice. If I had to pick a nickel, he would be it. Because outside of him, I'm not really sure. I have him listed as a corner, and certainly he can play corner. But we've seen him at nickel, and he's been good when he's been in there at that position group. So I'm curious to see, can Jaden McBurrows be that guy that Michigan needs him to be? So he's my biggest question mark overall. But then you've got other guys that you look at corner, staying at corner. There's two other players that I look at and say they are probably going to be in the mix one way or another. One is Josiah Edmond. He had kind of the same treatment as Jyaire Hill, though he did not necessarily play a ton regardless, right? You started seeing him coming in mid-season, and then his production kind of fell off from there. It wasn't like it was like he was getting in a ton of snaps, but same kind of thing that happened with Jyaire. It seemed like there was some off-field stuff that was going on there. But he was thought very highly of, like he committed as a flip from Purdue, was a 3-star, but he finished this as a 4-star. Michigan absolutely loved what he brought to the table. And I think tall, lanky corners are those types of guys that you look at and say, that's what they're going for. These just like big lockdown guys. So I'm curious to see what happens with him this year, but that he's one of the other two, the other one being freshman Shamari Earls coming off of an injury. In his finishing off his high school career, I think that they have pitched him very much as being a play first year guy. Can he work himself in kind of like Will Johnson did? Remember, Will Johnson, game 1 gave up a touchdown, and then you just didn't see it happen again. Really didn't come into his own until midseason against Rutgers. That was late October, early November. I think it was early November in 2022. And that was when Will Johnson had his coming out party, and then suddenly he was a star in college football, like just instantaneously. Shamari Earls has that kind of playability, right? He's got that type of potential. So it's all kind of on him as an early enrollee. Is he fully ready to go? Can he grasp the system? Can he beat out some other guys? Can he be involved in the competition and all of that? So he's one who I think you're going to absolutely see in rotation. I don't know that he will be a starter, but very well by the end of the year, he could be. Michigan brought in a ton of talent this year, and you can't necessarily look at younger players anymore and say, well, they're going to have to wait their turn. I think that's still the ideal, especially at a place like Michigan. But I think that Shamari Earls is the type of talent, much like the receivers when we talked about Andrew Marsh, much like some of the other position groups we talked about Nate Marshall, for instance. Certainly feels like the type of guy that could see the field earlier than later. And I guess the question is, what will help, I think, is the schedule to some degree, right? Because you've got weeks 1 and 3 are a little bit more casual. Why did that get mixed up dyslexically in my mind? I'm not sure. Casual weeks 1 and 3, still a more difficult game, a road game at Oklahoma in week 2. But unlike having Fresno State, which is not a very casual season opener for a group of 5 team, to be able to play, New Mexico or New Mexico State, whichever one it is, I always forget because they just don't really register in my brain. And then directional Michigan, again, doesn't really register in my brain. Is it CMU this year, I believe, finally? That just is going to allow Michigan to be able to essentially, if everything goes to plan, particularly offensively, to be in blowout situations where they can start working guys in. So we just have to see that, right? Sharon Moore took a long time before he got his first blowout victory, whether it's an interim or as the head coach. Took until that Northwestern game and then finally got it. And that's the only one, really, so far. I mean, because you look at the Arkansas State game and the Fresno State game. Fresno State took all the way to the end before it was like, okay, this game is out of hand. Arkansas State, they had that game in hand and then blew it. USC, same. Minnesota, same. So it'll be interesting to see if they're able to go out there and get some of those young guys in. We'll talk more about the young guys in a moment. But let's look at safety again. So we went through the top 5 guys. You're kind of looking at the freshmen. I'm going to discard those guys for the moment, and I'm going to look at Jacob Oden, who is a in-state guy. He is someone who was a 4-star and really came up strong. Legacy. His father, Rod Oden, who is the head coach at Harper Woods, where Jacob Oden played. I remember talking to him a couple years ago. It was 2020, and he was just, like Michigan wasn't really recruiting him yet. I was talking to Rod about Jacob and like how he's really improved, and then talking to Alan True at that same camp that I was at. He was like, I think that he's the type of guy that Michigan's eventually going to go after because he's seen such an ascension. Completely not really there last year. We saw him very sparingly, so it's hard to really say. He's a little bit on the smaller side. He could be the other guy that you'd look at and say more so of a nickel than a traditional safety, or could he work himself in? I mean, again, like I think his best case is to be that nickel, potentially behind Jade McBurrows, or at least challenge him for that. But it's a little hard to tell exactly where he's at. The last person I want to mention here in segment 2, as we just completely just stroll through this whole episode like it's nothing, is Tevis Metcalf, right? I think Michigan, I've heard rumblings that Michigan is extremely impressed by him, right? He's a 3-star guy, that went to Arkansas, transferred with his brother. No one's really talking about him. Kind of 3-star, but borderline unranked, right? Like transfer portal didn't really see him as anything. Played extremely sparingly, but they love his athleticism. And he's the type of guy that could really, like, he could play either safety or corner. So it's going to kind of be up to him. And that's going to be where it's going to be interesting to see in spring. Where does he land, right? Because he can play either of those positions. And don't be surprised if some of these others that we've mentioned, could a Mason Curtis move out to boundary? Could a Jaden Mangum move out to boundary? Like, or TJ Metcalf. Like, they're going to try to get the best that they can get out there. We've seen that they do a lot of meddling, and you saw that last year in particular with Zeke Berry moving from nickel to boundary. You saw Makari Page move from safety to nickel, and then they were able to run with a Brandyn, Hillman, Mason Curtis, Quentin Johnson, and Wesley Walker safety group. And it worked out really well. So you kind of can't necessarily say that you have a solid idea of what this is going to look like. But let's talk a little bit about the incoming freshman safeties. What are the chances that we see them? And then we've got a couple other names to mention at corner. We'll get to those here in just a moment. Tell you what, this studio space is getting cramped. I got a new light for if you're watching. We're going with the same lighting setup that we've always used since we've been in this space. When I was in Ann Arbor, I had lights hanging from the rafters in my basement studio. Basement here, Michigan basement. Can't really put a studio there. Need more space though here. I really wanted to use a new light. It's literally too big. Space. Partially because I got a treadmill over there that goes mostly unused. Still losing the weight regardless. Although I haven't been able to get out for walks. Thank you, Michigan, for being a tundra. It is just looking outside, man. It's depressing out there. Sun out today. That's at least nice. All right, let's talk about the names I haven't mentioned. Let's start with the freshman trio at safety because those are the ones that are left. I wouldn't be surprised to see any of the 3 play, but I would be most surprised, I think, to see Jordan Young, but it wouldn't surprise me if we did see him. I think that you've got some possibilities there. And I look at Kanewal Winston, who, again, we mentioned him the other day as being a player that if he was taller, an on-3 analyst said if he was taller, he would be looked at as a 5-star. Instead, he's a top 100 guy. I think he could be in contention along with Oden and McBurrows for that nickel spot. It kind of screams that, right? He's like a 5'11 guy, really instinctive player coming out of DC. Certainly highly thought of, kind of spurned Penn State to come to Michigan. And then Elijah Dotson, if he was able to early enroll, I would be a lot higher on his ability to see the field early. Very athletic, could play safety, could play corner, could be played wide receiver. He can do a little bit of everything. And you saw that if you paid attention to Belleville, because he did all of that, right? He played kind of wherever. Again, another really instinctual player. People should be a lot more excited about getting Elijah Dotson. If he wasn't seemingly tied to the hip, and when I say seemingly actually tied to the hip with Bryce Underwood, he would have been getting a lot more praise. Now, I'm as guilty as anybody with that because it was obvious once, for those who knew what was happening behind the scenes, once Elijah flipped from Pitt to Michigan, you knew Bryce was also going to flip from LSU to Michigan. Okay. And I know there were some people that came at me and said, give the kid his due. And he does deserve it, right? And that's one of those things like, talking to Connor about Elijah, he's like, people do not understand just how good he really is. So it's going to be interesting to see how quickly he can develop and can he find his way on the field early. Because he's got so much positional flexibility, you absolutely could see him. I'm just not 100% sure if you will, just because, I just go through this list of names: Rod Moore, Brandyn Hillman, Mason Curtis, Jaden Mangum, TJ Metcalf, and Jacob Oden. There's just people ahead there. And I'm not even mentioning TJ Metcalf or Tevis Metcalf. Could he be one of those guys? On the other side, I've only left one freshman out in terms of corner, and that's Jaden Sanders, who, again, not as an early enrollee, and that kind of sets him behind the 8 ball, but another guy who could also have some positional flexibility, has some speed, really shown some instinctive ability. I mean, you can say that about almost everybody, especially from the recruiting class. that they've just identified a lot of guys who are instinctive and have a nose for the football, which really obviously fits this system of all, right? It's not just man coverage locked down. It's, zone, man, match, all that kind of stuff, and then fly to the football. And Jaden Sanders is another one. He's not as tall as some of the others out there, but certainly could see time out there as well. But I think that he's probably a year away. But we'll see. Now, there's 3 names I haven't mentioned, and they're all at the cornerback position, and I'm just kind of throwing my hands up here with all 3. And you've got one that we saw sparingly early, and that's Ricky Johnson, who was a former starter at UNLV. He went out there against Fresno State, is the only game I can really truly remember him in, and it was like, what an absolute debacle. Again, the learning curve was a ball hawk at UNLV, but just it did not seem like it caught at Michigan. So I'm curious to see it. He still seems like he's around. Like I saw him at the bowl game. So can he take that step forward that is necessary to see the field? I don't know. Jeremiah Lowe entering year 2, really lowly ranked 3-star in like the thousands out of Kentucky. Kentucky seems like it's kind of an under scouted state. Hence we talked about Travis Moten and why he got his 4-star. Jeremiah Lowe seems undersized a little bit. He's not that big, tall guy, which is I don't know why. It's just the name like Jeremiah Lowe. You just feel like he'd be like 6'3". Don't ask me why I think that, but he's not that tall. So I'm a little bit curious about him as well. What is his niche? Could he be another guy that could work into that nickel position? I don't know. Just doesn't really seem like we heard much of anything about him. And then you've got the last player that I'm going to mention. We're going to keep this short and sweet today. And that's Caleb Anderson, the transfer from Louisiana, had basically zero production at Louisiana, but was coached by Lamar Morgan. So that Michigan, Lamar Morgan knows him, right? So that there was some vouching there. And again, I don't really know much about him. Didn't really do a heck of a lot while in Lafayette. But when you have a coach that already coached him before and says, yeah, let's bring him in, then that at least tells you that he feels comfortable with him. If nothing else, he's a depth piece and is part of that. But this is where you kind of start to wonder, can that be it? Because going through the safeties, I'm looking through and it's like, okay, maybe the freshmen don't play, but everyone else feels like they're going to. You look at the corners and you're like, okay, 2 for sure. But beyond that, I have no idea. That's where spring's going to tell us some things. Definitely some experience, like Jyaire Hill and Zeke Berry both started at corner. Behind them, no one has. But they obviously are going to want more than just 2. And you've lost some of those depth pieces that hadn't really played, like a Miles Pollard or a who's the other one? The other Tennessee guy. Killing me. Picture his face in my head. Cody Jones. There it is. Cody Jones. And they just didn't really work out, and they transferred both to Memphis. So it's going to be curious to see how they're able to fill that out a little bit more. And they lose some guys like Keyshawn Harris, who's been around forever as a redshirt, earned a scholarship, was a guy that started some games in early 2023, and was a type of guy you can rely upon. I don't know who else they have there. That's where spring's going to be interesting. Do they go to the transfer portal? Are there any intriguing names that come into the transfer portal in the spring period after the spring game and all of that? That's going to be the question. That's where losing some of the development pieces didn't work out. Like I mentioned, Cody Jones and Miles Pollard. You lose DJ Waller, who should have been a starter last year and then ends up going to Kentucky. You have some rebuilding to do with the room, but Lamar Morgan, quality coach. You've seen it. I mean, the fact that Amir Hall was able to have the type of games he was against Ohio State and Alabama, that kind of gives you a lot of faith and confidence in what Lamar Morgan's able to do at the position. So it'll be interesting to see. All right, that's going to do it for us today. We'll be back on Wednesday as we either continue our position outlook. We would probably combine linebacker and tight end to finish that off, or we will get to news. But anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you again soon. Peace.